Hi everyone. This is a combined presentation by Babri and Hasan. As architects, the topic of our presentation is Man, Myth and Space, the archetypal desire to build.
Here we shall try to understand the relationship between myths and our built spaces through cultural landscape of human history.
Introduction to the project. Before understanding the relationship between myth and architecture, we will first understand the importance of myth through the eyes of various philosophers, like Plato, Joseph Campbell, Michael Witzel, and W.R. Lethaby. Then we'll study the role of myth in architectural discourse, like in the work of Lebbeus Wood's Four Cities of Mythical Archetypes. We'll then move on to Carl Jung's collective archetypes in myths and how these archetypes influence and reoccur in the myth of paradise.
After a brief analysis of how the myth of paradise shaped the architecture of the ideal sacred across history, we'll then study architecture in terms of the myth of paradise, that is Eden. In this regard, we'll study two perspectives, a metaphorical view from the poet of the East, Allama Iqbal's Sargazisht-e-Adam, and an architectural interpretation from John Milton's The Lost Paradise. In the final stage, we will visually explore the concept of Eden through a fictional narrative in three phases, where we re-image the metaphorical space of Eden in a present cityscape of an old city.
Myth and introduction. The term myths is usually spoken in the sense of its general meaning, which is either a fantasy or a false story. For example, Merriam-Webster regards it as a parable or an allegory, whereas Collins Dictionary defines myth as a traditional story of unknown authorship that usually serve to explain some phenomenon of nature, like the origin of man or the customs, institutions, and religious rites of a people. This idea of myth as a fallacy or some kind of misrepresentation of truth is superficial, and this will become clear with the historical and philosophical theories that have been developed in this study.
Role of myth, a historical understanding. Throughout history, many anthropologists wondered what caused myths, but rather than looking for the question of what, one must first understand why myths. Why myths became such inherent to the human society. And for that, we'll have to look into history. Plato was the first to utilize myths in his philosophical endeavors. He did that by attempting to overcome the traditional opposition between stories and reason and integrated myth with philosophy. Plato was both a myth maker and a myth teller. He learned from Socrates and devised myths which he used to teach various philosophical matters that may be too difficult to follow if expounded in a blunt philosophical discourse. Joseph Campbell was an American writer who worked on comparative mythology. For him, myths are as important for the contemporary man as they were for the archaic man. He said, "Myths are public dreams, dreams are private myths. Myths are vehicles of communication between the conscious and the unconscious, just as dreams are." In these words, he presents myths as a recollection of collective psyche, evident from its imagery and symbols. Michael Witzel, a German comparative mythologist, provides a more recent analysis of different myths across the world. He followed an extensive research and came to the conclusion that he defined in his own words as follows. Myths are not inherently unscientific, fantastic, and hence untrue fairy tales about aspects of human life and nature. Nor are they intentionally invented, misleading, and supposedly untrue stories about topics otherwise important to us. Rather, myths deal with the question of the origin, the nature, and the ultimate destiny of the world and its human beings. Myths are part of the larger realm of religious thought that is characterized by symbolism.
Role of myth in architecture origins. The theory of origins of architecture presented by Vitruvius is fundamental to architectural discourse, but on a closer analysis, we realize that the theory of origins of architecture does not, in fact, talk about the origin of architecture. Instead, it talks about the origin of building in the form and functionality of nature like strength and beauty. W.R. Lethaby states this in his book Architecture, Mysticism and Myth. The theory of architecture, with its origin from the primitive hut and further development that varied according to the era and place, is actually the theory of building. Architecture itself is the thought behind form, that is realized and embodied for the purpose of manifestation. In other words, architecture becomes much more than of its material components like stone, wood, or steel, when its spatial component like light, space, and gravity serve to narrate a symbolic ideology that is present in myth. Myth in fictional architecture. Fictional architectural spaces have contributed to architectural discourse over the past years, from Piranesi's architectural fantasy to Alexander Brodsky's buildable and unbuildable paper architecture. Myths have been used in this fictional architectural discourse as directive narrative, especially in the work of architect Lebbeus Woods, according to whom myth is an all-embracing cyclic cosmology wherein man and culture are in perpetual movement between four cities of existential conditions. This cycle starts from the city of Earth, which is a metaphorical representation of dawn or birth of the human cycle. From birth, it moves on to the next stop in the city of fire in summer, which signifies his youth. In autumn, the youth reaches at dusk in the city of air, where it transitions to maturity. By midnight, the cyclic human condition finally reaches its old age in winter at the city of water. Myth and architecture, spatial archetypes. Up till now, we have established the importance of myth in human history, philosophy, and in fiction. Further, we'll study the underlying pattern in which myth influence our architecture of the built. Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who studied and cross-compared different myths in order to account for their unlikely spread with the human psyche, and he theorized that there exist fantasy images which reoccur in mythologies, and these fantasies are of a universal nature that are inherited across cultures and generations. He called them archetypes. These inherited archetypes are not a part of an individual's past, but they are stored and shared in a common library of human emotions, called the Library of Collective Unconscious. The Library of Collective Unconscious can be visualized in George Louis Borges' description of the Library of Babel, where he conceived the world as a hexagonal library in the form of a labyrinthine. Spatial archetypes and the myth of Eden. Carl Jung did a series of experiments with recurrent dreams in order to identify archetypes. He described and drew the recurrent images and elements across these dreams and published it in a compiled manuscript called the Red Book. A close analysis of these images elements show its similarity to the multiple myths cross-culture, but precisely a very common myth called the myth of Eden. Because among the similar recurring elements that have influenced the world mythology, the most recurring are the tree congruent with the word tree, the serpent, and the man. Other recurring spatial elements that have influenced our architecture of the ideal are the garden in the image of the labyrinth that has visual similarity to the ideal city by Vitruvius, the geometry of the physical axis that is observed and experienced in the grid-like division of the modern metropolis. The concept of paradise in architecture. The recurring elements that hint toward a universal myth throughout history correspond to particular architectural archetypes, which are as follows. Labyrinth has been a consistent element in mythology and sacred architecture, starting from the Daedalus, a mythical pre-classical architect and craftsman from Greek mythology, also called the Master of Labyrinth. Medieval century churches incorporated labyrinths in their designs, as in a maze on the floor of Chartres Cathedral that could be walked as a symbolic pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Amiens labyrinth, which is an octagonal maze inlaid on the floor of the nave of the cathedral, as described in the Bible of Amiens. Vault of Heaven and Dome. The vault of the heavens has always been geometrically signified with concentric circles, which have been architecturally translated into the infinite nature of dome. This is evident in Gustave Doré's illustration of the Divine Comedy, where Dante and Beatrice gaze upon the highest heavens. In Islamic interpretation of spiritual transcendence, which signifies the journey across the celestial spheres in Miraj, in the dome of Hagia Sophia, a case of cosmology in Islamic geometry, and in the perfect sphere of Pantheon as stated. The vault of the heavens, where the likeness of the form of it was that he showed the vestigium. The ascended form. Man's desire to reach the heavens has been a continuous struggle to achieve from the stairway to heaven in the Tower of Babel of the ancient man to the Burj Khalifa. The ascended steps are common in many temples like Badami Temple in India. Conclusion. Myth of Paradise and Architecture. The archetypes preserved in the various architectural manifestations point towards a fundamental myth that may serve as an exploration ground for the study and transformation of the coherent relationship between myth and architecture.
Origin of man, myth and space from Eden. Myth of Eden that talks of man's first house and his expulsion thereof from the divine dwelling might lead to the answer of its pursuit in every manifestation of the sacred in our spaces. Myth of Eden, a brief introduction. The philosophy of Eden in Christian mythology is the interpretation of original sin as man's eternal punishment, whereas Islamic philosophy treats Eden as a test ground and a testament of free will, knowledge, and its consequence to prepare man of the constraints of the physical world. The general sequence of events in the myth of Eden are as follows: the freedom achieved in Eden, the seed of earthly life already planted in Eden in form of the tree, the consequence of free will resulting the expulsion from the freedom of Eden to the restriction of profane time and gravity. Our research on the interrelationship between man, myth, and space traces back to man's first home, Eden. As a process, we develop a comparative visual study of the poetry on Eden from two perspectives and cultures, that is Sargazisht-e-Adam from the east and Paradise Lost from the west. In Sargazisht-e-Adam, Allama Muhammad Iqbal narrates the metaphorical chase of Adam, starting from the search for the paradise of his memory, as he recalls his expulsion from Eden in this poem. We will focus on the first book of Paradise Lost, where Milton unfolds the architecture of the pandemonium that originated as a response to the memory of Eden, illustrated here in John Milton's illustration. Starting from this slide, we have studied Iqbal's Sargazisht-e-Adam and have interpreted it in the form of hand drawings. The onset of chase. What a story I have to tell to anyone who will listen of how I traveled in foreign lands. I forgot the story of the first covenant in the garden of heaven. When I drank the fiery cup of awareness, I felt uneasy. I have always searched for the truth about the world, showing the celestial height of my thought. The pursuit. At times I cleared the Kaaba of stone idols, but at times put statues in the same sanctuary. At times to save a talk I went to Mount Sinai and hid the eternal light in the folds of my sleeve. By my own people I was hung on the cross. I traveled to the skies, leaving earth behind. For years I hid in the cave of Hira. I served the world its last cup of wine. Age of Enlightenment. When I failed to probe the reality of the stars, I spent nights on end wrapped in thought. The sword of the church could not frighten me. I taught the proposition of the revolving earth. I donned the lens of far-seeing reason and told the world the secret of gravity. I captured rays in the restless lightning, making this earth the envy of paradise. A final realization. But although my reason held the world captive to my ring, yet I remained ignorant of the secret of existence. When at last my eyes, worshippers of appearance, were opened, I found it already lodged in the mansion of my heart.
Paradise Lost, the excerpt from Book 1, takes place after the fall of Satan and starts from his perspective, where he contemplates over his condition in the memory of heaven. After escaping to hell, he decides to take revenge along with his companions. Here we find significant spatial instances, first in Satan's memory of paradise or Eden, then in the description of hell, and finally in the construction of pandemonium, which is Satan's response to the kingdom of paradise. The fall, hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruins and combustion down, to bottomless perdition therein to dwell, in adamantine chains and panel fire. The dungeons of darkness, the dismal situation, waste and wide, a dungeon horrible on all side round, as one great furnace flamed, Yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible. Regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes, that comes to all, but torture without end. A heaven of hell, farewell happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail horror, hail infernal world, and the profoundest hell receive the new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. The ascending pile. The ascending pile stood fixed her stately height, and straight the doors, opening their brazen folds, discover wide, within her ample spaces, over the smooth and level pavement from the arched roof, as from a sky the hasty multitude admiring entered, and provoked some praise and some the architect. Pandemonium, temple of power, built like a temple, where pilasters round were set, and Doric pillars overlaid with golden architrave, nor did there want cornice or frieze with bossy sculptures graven. The roof was fretted gold. Concluding the comparative analysis. While Iqbal gave a metaphorical interpretation of Eden, Milton gave a physical interpretation, but both theorized the region of architecture and the act of building as a response to the spatial memory of paradise. In Iqbal's work, the act came from man's search for Eden and achieved with the help of his reason. In Milton's work, it came from Satan's ego, which was a physical and literal manifestation in response to his memory of kingdom of heaven. In this way, Milton also presents his critique on the grand architecture, which focuses on the spectacle rather than the experience of space.
After concluding the desire to build as a response to the myth of Eden, the final stage visually explores how the metaphysical space of Eden became a precursor to the physical places through a fictional narrative compiled in 3 stages. The work is titled Man, Myth and Space, the Archetypal Desire to Build, with 3 sections. 1. The Spatial Drama of Eden. 2. The Pursuit of a Memory. 3. The Archetypal Manifestation of Eden in Space. Book 1. The Spatial Drama of Eden. This section starts with our protagonist's first experience in the metaphysical space of Eden, which slowly introduces him to the physical constraints of position, gravity, and mass as he reaches close to the restricted threshold. The pause breaks through the continuum of void. Its stillness whispers through my ears, creasing upon its curtains. The vibration is enough to wrinkle the veil in between. Shortly there will be no barrier between us. Alas, gradually the blind lifts. The visible frame captures a wide tract, a canvas that projects onto its depth, and I position upon it. The ways its appendages raised in procession, one after another in different dimensions, lay down the moving trails. The moving paths unfold, changing aisles. It tells me of my nature, that not to stay put. I change my position to the path laid ahead. It honors me, as the membrane enclosed behind. Go along, we are following its signs in this gesture. The movement slows down as it takes me to a different range. It soaks in a different shade. Following the tracks of chromes, I glance above. There, suspended in the high distance, lies the formation defined in no paths. The abyss that surrounds me follows up there, dissolving in the range of the orb, an arrangement of limitless nature. Yet that signals at an end. The turbulence of hues that gather up there motions me to reach it. I progress ahead and find my guide up, a weightless arrangement afloat as though of smoke and dust. The more I look, the closer it approaches. I can hold it, I affirm, and stretch myself up. The canvas uproots me from beneath as it extends itself from below to support me. I raise myself up another grade, and similarly stands a second level to receive me. And gradually in my ascension, different tiers set up in procession. After the ascent, the curvature opens to me. My stance here is embraced with turbulent fumes hoisted up, that run high and meet midway. They continue upright, yet run parallel in between. But the whole unites to vacillate in a continuous wave. As they weave together in different orientations, a space is captured in its reach. An alluring figure stands before me, dressed in her cloak of black. Her silhouette of distorted shapes follows through the expanse. I sense the shift in all its changing facets, but in its every dimension, there's one thing that stood still separately. Sometimes in an abandoned corner, sometimes behind a different plane, there's always an arrangement of wide proportion with rough skin. Each passing brings us close. Wonder what lies beyond it. But its formation didn't allow our passage, for we couldn't penetrate through its membrane. Just a crevice through its being, scarred in the mystery of the beyond. The ascent was difficult this time, but we'd each pass it to make the reveal. Strokes of radiant gold reach us winding down the lane. Following its trails, we reach the corner where the vibrant stream originates, intricately weaving us in its whirl of lure. How everything that surrounds us, the canvas, the membranes, the tears, even the hues, is drenched in its image. Hidden in the depths of this expanse, the source of its spirit is caged. Its strokes give permanence to this place. Its benevolent rays speak to us in whispered flow. Wonder what lies beyond this crevice. Its luminance should be within my reach. But it blinds me. I reach close to it to see what hides on the other side. The ground beneath me must have slipped. I see the stretch that I had traveled, drifting away from my vision in paced motion. Book 2, The Pursuit of a Memory. This section starts with our protagonist waking in the physical world with the memory of the metaphysical. His pursuit to go back home results in him building projections and physical planes that are identical to the ones in the metaphysical space. The vision recovers back to the vault of heaven that lies above. The scene opens up with a different lens. There, placed in the distant light, the threshold that I was just moments close to floats. A bright speck visible in the firmament calls me. The view pans around and a certain memory knocks on this side of the threshold. The space is there, but not quite here. It's a static reflection of the above, a stagnant arrangement of the above, and he, a being of movement. In this seek, he kept count of the moments passing, through the orchestrated transformation of the wide, between the light and the dark, and in one such changing hours came across a formation, its component defined of grain solidified into the barrier that reaches high. In its image, I see the presence of something familiar, an ascension. The ground won't allow me to rise above, but if I could make the ground that holds me raise on my command, I could escape to the memory I lived once. I take out parts of its mass, a little from here and some from there, until the negative molds to the image. A procession of levels, one grade above the other, laid in the solid by me, I devise my way up through the mounted barrier. The configuration of mass had terminated, but the ascension wasn't complete, so wasn't the message. The composition ended, not my chase. I shall make my own in the same way, add a layer atop to what has been. I attempt to add with the negative in representation of steps I carved before. But to my dismay, my creation wouldn't follow me. The earth would call it right back to meet its reach below. I can't soar high if my roots are not grounded deep enough, it conveyed in silence. So gradually I sculpt a projection, rising high in steep motion, anchoring each level down to the base in its mass, and projections thereof erected to support the rest that comes ahead. Signing in unison to the opening above, paths begin to follow me in my chase. On the composition assembled, I see my shadow projected across the grain. A certain part of that memory that I had forgot, I found in my composition of realized matter. A projection of me in there, found across the projection I raised here. A familiar companion guides me to truth. I found what I sought. This realization led me to discover the sphere, the preservation and memory of heavens in its limitlessness.
Book 3. The Archetypal Manifestation of Eden in Space. This section starts as our protagonist wakes up in a modern landscape of a city where he experiences the nostalgic expression of Eden throughout his day. The scene ends as the curtain lifts. The slumber recovers back to reveal the reality of another day to him. Ceiling of worn material limits the sky to me, but the light still reaches him through the cracks therein, like in an attempt to unveil the limitless that spreads beyond his room. But the thought of the hours in hustle blinds him from it. Quickly I must carry my business, for time won't wait for me. I leave, and my vision catches something I know. The intent to ignore lays waste. It just won't allow me to escape past it. Like someone calls for me from behind, but there isn't none but me in the captivity. Giving up after all to its calling, he turns around in command to the memory of his vision. It takes me to the window that sits in that corner, the one who would always remind me to look for it. It doesn't belong here, he always felt, for it took him to the encompass that lied beyond there, the city in its narrow passages, the trails that guide the buildings, tracks that go left, then some that go right. I travel through them, and in a moment recover myself back to the window that took me there. I never seem to get it. It doesn't seem a part of here. The next moment, I find myself in the labyrinth I just had experienced through my window. This thought dawns on him whenever he moves through the city. Sometimes I wonder if I'm actually even here, or still standing at the window. It makes me question my position here as my mind drifts off. Moving through the trails that have been laid in a chase, the edifice that surrounds it moves past him. In every direction I move, each turn that I take, I always find it leading up. The path that spread horizontal extend deep such that they seem to run perpendicular. The journey's end brings him to his destination, for he could see its reference near, and the thought of reminiscence escapes his amnesic mind as the craftsman sets on to work. I enter the sanctuary. I don't know much about its story, but they say its dome needs restoring. A glance above to study it, and through its cracks observed, a distant memory of something seeps in. The fissure in its curvature reveals the sky that hides behind it. However, it still completes what is missing. It's like they both merge together to form the same image. What part needed restore? I try to understand, but a nostalgia of something in the image takes over. He leaves the space different than he had entered it. The weight of a strange recollection has taken over my conscience. There, on his way out, it greets him again. The barricade wall that sheltered the place meets high in curvature, framing in its void what lies ahead. Behold, the threshold. How come I hadn't noticed it on the way in? Did it still stand here? It exists at the limit of what I experienced and the intuition of another. As the time of the day approaches near its end, the memory grows stronger. He tries to look for a similar experience in the spaces he finds next. As I course through my way back, in the niches I seek the endlessness of the labyrinth. Eventually, the chase he sought in the labyrinth approaches close to his abode, the starting point. It towers high like many rest, Through the image that penetrates, I see now how the labyrinth that's extended deep now travels up. It must be a dream that keeps recurring to the space, I think, for I have no memory of it and I know I'm not amnesic. Before I enter my room, the experience transcends again, as I stand at the balcony, the threshold of my space here, and my recollection there stand together to greet me. The two have become one. I can't differentiate one from the other. It's not my memory that reflects here, it's the memory of the space made in its image.
Concluding this presentation, we see that the relationship of architecture with myths started as a tool devised in preservation of a memory that was borrowed from a common myth. That memory in myth is the most fundamental of architectural space, that is home. Theory of architecture, when studied from this perspective, where it started as a pursuit in response to an ideal, regains its status of the ritual. We, as designers, are part of this pursuit in chase of an ideal in our creative capacity when we draw, design, and sculpt. The city, with its narrow configuration of streets, walls, and facades, is like the labyrinth. It's a collection of multiple myths which, when viewed through a broader lens, tells of a single tale. With this realization, we realize that architects have some control over this labyrinth. In his configuration of space, he is actually designing the chase.